Hi, everybody. My name is Nora Kyle Messier, and I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I'm here to introduce our newest episode of Hidden Collections. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a regular viewer, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. It's our custom here at the museum to begin all of our programs, whether we are together in person, which we are doing yet again here in Vineyard Haven now in March, but not today in this program, and for our online programs. We always take a moment to acknowledge and pay due respect to the Wampanoag people on whose ancestral land, here known as Nobnocket on Noepe, the museum stands. We recognize their millennia of stewardship, their continued presence in and contributions to our island and our community. Today, we're celebrating Women's History Month with a look at the important but often obscured or omitted contributions that island women have been making to our history for generations. Women appear in historical records less frequently than men, and the provenance of objects doesn't always identify the women who may have made or owned them. What better stage for these tales than here on Hidden Collections? I'll turn you over to our ever popular host and inimitable research librarian, Bo Van Riper, in just one moment after the standard preliminaries. Feel free to pop any questions that you might have into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. And I'm sure Zoom has already told you, but just as a reminder, we are recording this for future reference. Thanks again for being here. Bo, I hand them off to you. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, as always, to Savannah behind the scenes, making sure my picture appears in that little rectangle on your screen. We love stories about exceptional lives, and so every year when X History Month rolls around, we round up the usual suspects and tell their now familiar stories. Black History Month in February brings us Charles Drew and Martin Luther King and Benjamin Banneker and Ida B. Wells. Women's History Month brings us Eleanor Roosevelt and Helen Keller and Sally Ride and so on and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. The strains of La Marseillaise or Solidarity Forever, the cadences of the Gettysburg Address or the I Have a Dream speech move us in part because they're familiar, because they resonate with previous times we've heard it, because we know what's coming. But what about the unexceptional lives? And what about the untold stories in history? Laurel Thatcher Ulrich famously observed that well-behaved women rarely make history. Now that's become a bumper sticker rallying cry, a reminder, and fair enough, that change often requires sticking your thumb in the eye of convention. But Ulrich actually meant it as an observation about the invisibility of well-behaved women of past eras. Women, she argued, whose actions were seen as unremarkable and so went largely unrecorded, are virtually invisible to us. She became famous as a historian, in fact, by resurrecting the life through the journal of Martha Ballard, a midwife who worked on the then frontiers of Massachusetts in the early 19th century, and who must have had dozens, scores, hundreds of other women like her, who, because they kept no journal, or because their journals weren't preserved, or because nobody ever found them if they were, have slipped into obscurity, perhaps never to return. We know little of these women's lives. Frequently, we don't even know their names. The one unmarried woman on the Mayflower is known to history simply as John Carver's maidservant. That is literally virtually all we know of her. History is filled with women whose stories we can only tell in terms of what was typical and representative for the place in which they lived and the complex intersection of race, creed, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation that they occupied. If, however, we dig deep and look carefully, If we look in places where historians have for far too long not deigned or bothered to look, we can find places where the well-behaved women of past eras left their footprints, however faint, in the sands of time. The rest of this hour is about some of the traces that the lives of some well-behaved women left in the Martha's Vineyard Museum archives. If this document looks unbelievably old, that's because it is. It dates from 1683, and like so many documents from the 17th century in the Martha's Vineyard Museum archives, it records a transfer of land, specifically a transfer of land between a Wampanoag individual and an English individual. It's one small step in the long multi-step process that over the course of a century left the Wampanoag dispossessed of nearly all of an island that they had once been in complete control of. In that respect, this document is entirely typical and representative. Yet, in another respect, it is not typical or representative in the slightest. Because if you look closely at it, you'll see that the person writing the document or dictating the document for someone else to write, opening it with the standard phraseology of 17th century land deeds, know all men by these presents that I, insert your name, do grant this piece of land forever and in perpetuity to fill in other person's name. The person selling the land in this document is named Nottaquantum, alias Elizabeth. Like a lot of Wampanoag individuals in the 17th century, Nottaquantum used both her Wampanoag name and an adopted English name that these strange people who'd come in their tall ships 50 years earlier found easier to pronounce and keep track of. Nottaquantum, an alias Elizabeth, was called by the English Queen Sachem. That is to say, she was a Wampanoag woman who wielded political power individually and not just as a member of the advisory collective that gave advice to the male sachem. Here, Nottaquantum is granting a piece of land in what the English knew as Chickamauga, the space between the eastern side of Lambert's Cove and the western side of Lake Tashmo, to one Hannah Daggett, making this not only the oldest document in our archives to which both signatories are women, but one of the few documents in our archives to which both signatories are women. Hannah Daggett is herself a fascinating character about whom we know virtually nothing. She was the daughter of Thomas Mayhew Sr., and particularly after the death of her brother Thomas Mayhew Jr. at sea in 1657, that is to say, decades before this document was signed. Hannah was, it can reasonably be inferred, her father's favorite. Of all his four daughters, she was the one on whom he seemed to dote, and whom, in the absence of Thomas Jr. after 1657, he seemed to see as his natural successor, along with his grandson Matthew, Thomas Jr.'s oldest son. Hannah Mayhew grew up and married Thomas Daggett, another early settler. And there is at least a legend passed on by Charles Banks, the historian, that upon their marriage, Mayhew Sr. took Daggett aside and advised him to let Hannah have her head, to let her, as the saying goes, do as she pleased, because she was a strong woman who knew what she wanted and had the intelligence to pursue it. And life, Thomas Sr. is alleged to have said, would be happier for both her and her new husband if they admitted that up front. Hannah did, in fact, go on to play a significant independent role in the late 17th century history of Martha's Vineyard, buying and selling land, owning land in her own right. Next slide, please. Here's another one of the multiple deeds in the collection that bear her signature and her seal. This one granting land that she owns in 1691 to her son, Joshua Daggett. Hannah was remarkable for her time. She would have been remarkable for any time prior to the 20th century, in that she was a woman who functioned independently in the world of affairs, buying and selling land, making deals with other individuals independently of her husband, and not in the office of widow under which women were able to conduct such business. Even with Hannah, though, all we know about her, except for those stories passed down by banks, which could well be family apocrypha, all we know of her is what we glean from these few business records, from land sales, from the odd account or receipt, from the odd document to which she served as her husband's witness when he was selling a piece of land or whatnot. This is not at all atypical for women in the 17th, 18th, even 19th century vineyard. They brush up against history only in places where they had contact with the legal system. The only records we have of them is in deeds and other legal documents. So we can infer what kind of a woman Hannah was, but we don't have a glimpse into her mind, into her heart, into the kind of person she was to interact with. We don't have even a record of her voice in her own words, because the language of these documents is purely formal and purely transactional. They are, by definition, designed to reveal nothing of the individual. They serve the process and they serve the system. They don't give you a glimpse of the person whose name is at the top or the bottom. Next slide, please. This document, and it's zoomed out because I want you to notice the sheer length and depth of detail rather than any particular bit. This is an accounting submitted by a Dr. Simon Bacon to Anne Mayhew, another member of the founding English family of the Vineyard's colonial era, in the early 1700s. Anne was a widow by this point, and as the length and detail of this particular bill shows, she was in her declining years suffering from a variety of ailments that required Dr. Bacon's constant intercession to keep her as healthy and as happy as possible. That long list details home visits, details medications, details procedures performed, each of them reckoned in pounds, shillings, and pence, because this was, after all, the early 1700s. And the vineyard was still very much a part of Britain. This is, apart from one or two other documents, the only record of Anne Mayhew we have. And we are lucky beyond words to even have this. It's a remarkable glimpse into medical care in the early 1700s. And it's a remarkable reminder of something that, by and large, until relatively recently, tends to fall out of our understanding of history. that sickness and health and the need to go to the doctor and look for a way to be made whole or made well, or at least to ease the pain you were feeling, is something that goes back thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. It's one of the fundamental experiences of being human. And the ability to mitigate pain, to repair injury, to try at least to ameliorate, if not cure or banish outright, disease, is something that humans have been struggling with since before there were written records to capture the details of the process. Nearly all those records have disappeared, but in Anne Mayhew's case, we have a glimpse of what it was like in the early 1700s to grow old and feel your body starting to fail, and turn to a doctor who, though he doubtless did his best, probably couldn't do anywhere as much as the patient might in a more perfect world have wished. Next slide. Mary Hillman of Holmes Hole, the coastal village that was by then in the 1830s rising to prominence as one of the most significant ports along the Atlantic coast of North America. Mary Hillman in 1837 had her own problems. She was an old woman by then, having long since left her husband Peleg Hillman in Boston and returned to the village where she'd grown up before the Revolution. And she was, as she wrote in this document, grown poor in her old age. So she did something remarkable. She sat down and, in the office of the Justice of the Peace, she dictated this affidavit. And in the affidavit, she says in 1837, back in the days of the Revolution, the town of Holmes Hole erected a liberty pole, as it was called in those days. And people gathered around it and protested the actions of the minions of King George. I love that phrase, the minions of King George, by holding political protests and whatnot. And there came a day in 1777, as I recall it, she wrote, many, many decades after the fact. There came a day when a British ship of war, the Unicorn, I believe it was, came to Holmes Hole Harbor, and the captain, needing a replacement for a damaged spar, offered to buy the Liberty Pole from the townspeople, it being the only stick of timber that would do for the purpose. In a hastily called meeting, Mary remembered the leaders of the town had voted to sell the Liberty Pole to the captain of the Unicorn, but that night she, Mary, then known as Polly Daggett for her marriage, and her friends Maria Allen and Parnell Manter snuck out under cover of darkness, bored holes in the pole, filled them with gunpowder, and blew the pole to smithereens, saving, as she said, the town's honor in not having to sell its symbol of liberty to the British. This is, she concluded, the equivalent of an army taking the flag or standard of an opposing invader in wartime. And therefore, she goes for the big finish, I would request that your honors grant me such a pension as a veteran of the Revolution as I might see fit. Mary Hillman, an elderly woman in a tiny coastal village on the shores of Holmes Hole, was writing to the Congress of the United States in an era when the revolutionary generation was dying, and asking, as many veterans and the widows of veterans of that war were asking, that Congress consider them in the pension scheme it had voted into law. We know about Polly Daggett, the 17-year-old girl who, under cover of darkness, helped to blow up the Liberty Pole. and gave the vineyard one of its few bright spots in an otherwise fairly dark and grim history during the Revolution. We know about Polly Daggett, the teenaged heroine, but here's another view of Polly Daggett, elderly Mary Hillman, who is among the last people left in Holmes Hole, still alive, who remembers the day when when the Unicorn sailed into the harbor and she and her friends committed domestic terrorism in the interest of a nation not yet born. Next slide, please. The back page of Mary's affidavit was signed not only by the Justice of the Peace, Thomas Dunham, but by Leroy Yale, the local physician, by several prominent local sea captains, a local attorney, and not a total of 9 leading citizens of the town. All of them middle-aged, all of them men, all of them, unlike her, able to vote, all of them, unlike her, considered fully human, fully functional adults in the eyes of the law. Mary submitted a second petition 2 years later, refined and expanded, and accompanied by an affidavit by Captain Thomas Dunham, who as a young man had watched the Liberty Pole erected and attested that he, like the others, had many times heard Mary relate the story of how she blew up the Liberty Pole and assert that they all to a man believed that she was telling the truth. We don't know whether Mary Hillman got her pension. We do know that both these affidavits were filed in the Library of Congress archives, where they were discovered in 2015 by a researcher here at the museum. I like to think that she got the pension and that she lived out her last days in the comfort that a heroine deserves. Next slide, please. The building on the left nowadays is the home of the Martha's Vineyard Garden Club, but it was in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, part of the island's own modest industrial revolution. It was a woolen mill where wool was first carded and then spun and woven into wool cloth, particularly a trademark densely woven fabric called satinette that was used to make sailors' coats and similar things. The West Hisbury mill, when it operated processing the wool from Up Island sheep, was, like most mills in southern New England at the time, staffed predominantly by young women. We know virtually nothing about the lives of the women who worked at the West Hisbury satinette mill. Less, for example, than we know about the mill girls, as they were known at the time, of Lowell or Lawrence or Haverhill or Tiverton or Fall River. We know that they were employed in part because they were thought to be handier at the work of working looms and running spindles and throwing shuttles and whatnot, because their fingers, it was said, were small and nimble, and because they could be paid lower wages for the same hours worked. There is in the files of the Garden Club a document written by one of those mill girls from West Hisbury when she was elderly and looking back over many decades on the work she did in her youth. And it speaks of the happy chatter of the girls who worked at the looms and the sunshine coming through the windows, and paints a bright and rosy picture of it. And we shouldn't discount that. It's the only firsthand report we have of what life was like inside the walls of what's now the Garden Club, back when it was part of the Industrial Revolution. But nor should we take it entirely at face value. The passage of time improves everybody's memory. The pain is dissipated, the joy burnished. We remember the past all too frequently as a world where, in the words of Garrison Keillor, all the men are strong, all the women are good looking, and all the children are above average. Yet, looking around us at the present, we have reason to suspect that that might improve a bit on the reality of the past as it was. So take that account of a long ago West Hisbury mill girl for what it is, and stack it up alongside the accounts we have of the mill girls in Tiverton and Fall River and New Bedford and Lawrence. Stack it up against the Bread and Roses strike, and stack it up against James Taylor's song Mill Worker, in which a nameless factory worker laments her broken body and wasted life, spent 10 and 12 hours at a time bent over a loom in a dark, dust-filled room somewhere in a factory in Massachusetts. And keep your eyes out for other documents that might add a few more pieces to our glimpse inside what we now know mostly just as an empty building. Next slide, please. This is a poem which I will spare you the reading of. Is the first of about 10 beautifully handwritten pages about a Revolutionary War hero from Cape Cod, and it's titled General Dimmock of Falmouth Town. And if you've read Longfellow's Conquered Hymn or Story of Hiawatha, you can pretty much envision what you're going to get here. A long, long, long ballad stanza poem about a moment in American history in which all the heroes are square-jawed and peerless in their bravery and their ingenuity and all that other good stuff. General Dimmock of Falmouth Town doesn't quite win the Revolutionary War and write the Declaration of Independence simultaneously and single-handed, but he certainly comes across as a remarkable guy. This is an entire genre of late 19th, very early 20th century poetry. This particular piece was written by Edna Coffin of Edgartown, but Longfellow notwithstanding, this kind of stuff was written on an amateur basis by the blooming yard, by middle class and upper middle class, educated, married women. It was, I think you could reasonably call it a fad. You've got L.P. Selliver's poem reprinted in the Intelligencer decades ago about how a stalwart farm wife in Edgartown stood down a redcoat who was trying to take her last calf. You've got a dramatic narration too, actually, by different authors about Polly Daggett and her pals blowing up the Liberty Pole, and on and on and on. This kind of dramatic narrative poetry was something that women of a certain class and a certain age and a certain station in late 19th, early 20th century vineyard culture did for both their own amusement, but also because it was a kind of statement, like joining the DAR if you were qualified by having a Revolutionary War ancestor, and engaging in acts of historic preservation or being parts of historic pageants like the ones in 1911, 12, and 13. It was a way of both demonstrating your concern for history and literature and other refined subjects, but also of celebrating the nation's storied and glorious past. Next slide, please. This is a colored pencil sketch by Jenny Marchant, who was a woman from a large Edgartown family, and like Edna Coffin, author of General Dimmock of Falmouth Town, was a member of a particular social stratum. She was white, she was upper middle class, She was married, she was well-to-do, she was leisured, she was educated to the extent that women were of her class and race and station were educated in that era. And she was, one suspects, bored out of her skull. Because being intelligent and educated and cultured, having been raised in a house with books and art and pianos and whatnot, she then went forth into adulthood, into a world that expected her to be wife first, mother second, household manager third, and individual outside of those parameters, a distant fourth. Writing narrative poetry, getting involved in historic preservation, belonging to the DAR, the Want to Know Club, or the Women's Club, or the Homemakers Club, were among the opportunities for self-expression that people like Edna Coffin and Jenny Marchant had in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Art like this was another. Watercolors and pencil sketches were considered a not only legitimate, but proper and desirable and admirable leisure time enterprise for a woman of Jenny Marchant or Edna Coffin's place in society. And although Jenny Marchant's work isn't going to make anybody, next slide, forget, say, Amelia Watson, who was of the same station in society, of the same race, of the same class, of the same background, but who had artistic talent on a level a couple of notches above your average middle-class woman dabbling in watercolors. Jenny Marchant, nonetheless, had a high degree of skill. That's a beautifully rendered little image of an Edgartown house. And, next slide, please. She's got more on the ball than just, wow, that's a house and that would make a pretty picture. Here's her sketch of a Native American, but notice the text. Prior to the Pisas, I was here, and even before the Mayhews did appear. Now, I mean, yes, trivially true and an unremarkable sentiment today, but notable for the fact that she was openly acknowledging the Wampanoag presence on the island as predating that of the English, but also drawing the Wampanoag individual in this particular work not as some kind of an abstracted, exotic embodiment of the vanishing Indian, the vanishing savage, and so on and so forth. Give or take the feathered headdress and the hair that would have been unconscionably long for a man in Jenny Marchant's time in white culture. That's the face of an individual human being. There is more going on in Jenny Marchant than just an upper middle class woman of leisure who's using watercolors and colored pencils to fill her time. She's also aware, clearly, of the existence of the Pease tradition, the idea that John Pease and 5 followers landed on the vineyard and established the first English settlement a decade or so before the coming of the Mayhews in 1642. We don't know much about Jenny Marchant, but her writings and her art, like Edna Coffin's poetry, gives us a small glimpse into what it was like to be someone like her 120, 130 years ago. Next slide, please. Not everybody in late 19th century had it as easy as Edna Coffin and Jenny Marchant. Mrs. Peter L. Sylvia wrote this letter to her husband in November of 1897 when he was away as the second mate on a whale ship. Peter, it begins, and then, dear sir. And it goes on about why have you not written to your son after he wrote you more than 2 weeks ago? He's very hurt. He thinks his father doesn't know he exists. Also, what about the money you promised to send me? I can barely make ends meet here. Why are you doing this to me? When are you coming home? You said the voyage would be over soon. You'd said you'd be back on the island, and yet you're still away. Why are you doing this to me? There are relatively few letters written from any member of a whaling ship crew below the level of captain that have survived. Even fewer from family members on shore. This one is an extraordinary rarity. And it captures not only in its sentiments, but also, next slide, please, in the text itself, something of the emotions that Mrs. Peter L. Sylvia must have been going through. The first page was neat, tidy handwriting, evenly spaced, nicely sized. By the second page, the handwriting's bigger, the spacing between the words is more spread out. There are crossouts, there are interlinings. You get the impression that at the beginning of the letter, Mrs. Sylvia had sat down, composed and determined to lay out her case in as calm and cool and rational a manner as possible, but that by the time she got to page 4, emotions were getting the better of her, and her frustration and anger and despair at what she was going to do with winter coming on and her husband still absent, no money in the bank, had gotten the better of her. You can almost feel her either breaking down or giving in to anger, or perhaps both. And no, without digging back through the marriage records, we have no idea what her first name was. Women being referred to as Mrs. Husband's name is just one of the ways, one of the more trivial ways in which women get erased from the historic record. One of the most significant sources we have on the early history of houses in Holmes Hole was written by and published under the name of Mrs. Howes Norris. It's listed as in their catalog as Norris, comma, Mrs. in square bracket Howes, because we still haven't been able to find out what the poor woman's actual name was. Next slide. Mary L. Adlington, postmistress of Edgartown, operating the post office when it was at the four corners where Water Street met Main Street. Here she is in her domain with letters and papers stuck in the cubby holes, looking like the absolute master of all things postal that come and go into the Shire town of Dukes County. Mary Adlington's picture was taken by Richard Shute, local photographers, one of a series where it seems he went up and down Main Street knocking on the doors of businesses and saying, "May I set up my camera in your doorway and take a shot of your establishment?" You get the distinct impression that she said yes, but she wasn't terribly happy about it. And she would thank young Mr. Shute to get on with it and get on about his business so that she could get back to hers. Women were surprisingly well represented in the post offices of late 19th and early 20th century Dukes County. as they were in the classrooms of the schools of the various vineyard towns, as they were at the exchanges where calls from those newfangled instruments called telephones were routed to their proper destination. This photograph of Mary Adlington, it is, among all the shoot photographs of Main Street businesses, the only one to feature a woman not just in the photograph, but as the proprietor of the establishment. Women were very much part of the formal as well as the informal workforce in the vineyard, on the vineyard in the late 19th and the early 20th century. They were washerwomen and innkeepers, hotel staff and postmistresses, teachers, of course, and also, like Thankful Downs and Vineyard Haven, telephone operators. Work then, and still to a degree, is significantly gendered, but it was never more significantly gendered than it was in the late 19th and the early 20th century. That Mary Adlington rose to the position of postmistress for Edgartown suggests one of the few things we know about her, that she was a woman with extraordinary drive and ambition, who commanded the respect of men and women alike, and was capable of doing a complicated job with a high degree of efficiency. By the look of the picture, she was also pretty good at keeping ambitious young photographers in their place. Next slide, please. It is based on the collections that they come in as part of, overwhelmingly through the actions of women, presumably preserving their children's memories for years to come, that we know about the inner life of schools on Martha's Vineyard from the late 19th century down through the 20th. We have an extraordinarily rich collection of ephemera, yearbooks, programs like this one from a 1920s Christmas pageant at Hisbury School, graduation announcements, school plays, and a dozen other things in our collection. We have vast amounts of information about special events that went on over the course of nearly a century at the island schools, and we have it overwhelmingly because women of multiple generations from multiple families saved those things, put them away in boxes, and kept them safe from the ravages of time. If you look at the accession records behind documents like this, next slide, please, they are overwhelmingly passed on to us by women, often passing on something that their mothers or grandmothers put away the better part of a century ago. This particular one came to us last year in a collection of papers from Martha Flanders. And thanks to her and several generations worth of prior female relatives, we know that at the Hisbury School in 1920, the entire cast of the pageant sang as their third number a misspelled rendition of A Christmas Carol, followed by The First Christmas and Luther's Cradle Hymn, and on and on and on. Someday, somebody's going to have enough time to run these names against the rosters of Hisbury School students and see if, in fact, Alton is also the Alton who played cornet in the Hisbury Brass Band, and whether Gracia is, in fact, Gracia Eldridge, although I think she'd be too old in 1920, the daughter of Captain George Eldridge, the chart maker and tide book publisher. But someday, just not today. And when that day comes, thanks to Martha Flanders and her female forebears, we'll know that much little more about the lives of school children in the year following the great influenza pandemic of 1918-19. Next slide, please. That's Katherine Cornell in the white jacket and the plaid blouse, Helen Keller, Eleanor Roosevelt. If you wanted a picture that represents the celebrity culture on Martha's Vineyard before Carly Simon and John Belushi and James Taylor and the rest of them, well, that's a pretty good example. The three of the most famous women of the mid-20th century, Cornell, the actress, Keller, the social activist, Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady, who memorably lobbied for better treatment of women and African Americans by her husband's administration, and arranged for Marian Anderson to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when the DAR denied her use of Constitution Hall because she was African American. Three of the most powerful, path-breaking women of the mid-20th century gathered together at Cornell's home on the shores of Lake Tashmoo in 1952. But who took the picture? The answer is almost certainly Elizabeth Suppas of Hisbury, previously of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and New York City, who loved the theater and went to work for Cornell and her husband, producer Guthrie McClintock, as a personal assistant and general organizer of their lives, who became Cornell's personal assistant and also personal friend, and looked after Cornell's affairs on the Vineyard for the rest of the great actress's life. Elizabeth Suppas was known by her family and close friends as busy because she always seemed to have her hands in 100 different activities. And several years ago, when she died, nearly 100, Busy Suppas's estate passed on a large collection of her papers and photographs to the museum, including this one. Significantly, none of the pictures in that collection were of Busy Suppas herself, but the pictures provide an almost unparalleled document, an unparalleled chronicle of Katherine Cornell's and Guthrie McClintock's lives in their summer home on the Vineyard, and Cornell's encounters with the famous and the powerful and the historically significant, like Helen Keller and Lillian Hillman, Gregory Peck, Eleanor Roosevelt, and all the rest. Missing from all this is Busy Suppas herself, and yet she was an integral part of Katherine Cornell's life and the island's life for decades, running the Rice Playhouse in the years immediately after World War II, Summer Theater on East Shop, serving on multiple Hisbury town committees, including the finance and personnel committees for years, helping to organize the refurbishment of the second floor of the town hall was the Katherine Cornell Memorial Theater, and on and on and on. Everybody knows Katherine Cornell, but very few people who didn't know her personally remember Busy Suppas, through whose eyes and whose camera we now remember Cornell's time on the Vineyard. Next slide, please. Helen Tyra of Edgartown was the probation officer for the Dukes County Court when Senator Ted Kennedy drove his black Oldsmobile off Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick one summer night in July 1969. And so when she became his probation officer after he was charged with leaving the scene of an accident, she became a lightning rod for everybody with a comment to make about Kennedy, his sentence, his probation, and so on and so forth. The flood of letters just intensified when the Boston Herald ran a story in which she was quoted as saying that Kennedy would be treated like any other probationer. Here, a friend of hers sent her a clipping of from the paper and saying, "The picture doesn't do you justice, but yay for your even-handed treatment of our most famous Malefactor, carry on, love to you, I'll see you soon. Next slide, please. And then there was the letter signed, an interested friend writing from Houston, Texas, who advised that it was all well and good that that she was treating him with such even-handedness and not giving him special treatment because he was a Kennedy, or treating him more harshly because he was famous. And well, if the people of Massachusetts wanted to reelect him as senator, that was their business. But they darn well better think twice about what the rest of America thinks before they try to foist him on the nation as a presidential candidate. Next slide, please. There was some helpful person from Virginia who wrote to Mrs. Tyra enclosing a clipping from a local newspaper about Kennedy's traffic violations in the Commonwealth further to the south of ours. Next slide, please. And then there was Thomas J. Doolin of Redondo Beach, California, who wanted to know what would constitute grounds for revocation of parole in Massachusetts. What he thought he was going to do with the information if he got it is a question that history, alas, has no answer for. And then finally, next slide, please. There was some letter, not alas in the Tyra collection, that alarmed Helen Tyra to the point where she forwarded it to the FBI, who in turn forwarded it to the Secret Service because it contained what she judged to be threats against the health of then President Richard Nixon. She got a response 3 days later. The FBI was nothing if not efficient. And so, thanks to Helen Tyra's diligence in doing her job, and thanks to the efficiency of the FBI, the Martha's Vineyard Museum collection now includes a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the FBI, thanking her for her service to the country and her diligence in looking out for the health of the president. Well-behaved women do occasionally, in small ways, make history. Next slide, please. Barbara Bradley Greenough began keeping a diary when she was well into the back end of her middle age. A descendant of an old Edgartown family, she spent her off-island time in Wellesley, her vacations and whatnot on the vineyard. And she began keeping a diary, she recorded, as a way of recording and coming to grips with her thoughts, with processing her feelings about being a middle-aged woman, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, and then a widow, a poet, an artist, a lesbian who'd come to that realization late in her life, and so on and so forth. Her diaries covered decades from the mid-70s on down to her death. And as interesting as the diaries are, they fill 4 boxes in the archives. Even more interesting in some ways are the papers that were found tucked between the pages. Here, a poem that she wrote at the age of 17 and gave to her father, in whose drawers it was found after his death. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here, a clip, whoops, back up one, please. Here, a clipping that a friend had sent her of from a newspaper story about Barbara, that's her in the middle with the glasses around her neck, participating in some kind of a charity event, accompanied by a gushing, lots of capitals, lots of underlining, the word radiant circled, from a friend who noticed it and was so happy to see her friend in the paper. You'll notice that the note ends, "Praise God for your sobriety, love in AA, Betsy." because Barbara Greenow's frankness and openness about her struggles with alcohol is one of the running themes in her diaries. And given its centrality to the experience she was narrating, one has the impressions part of the motivation for donating those diaries to the museum, where after her death, other people would be able to read them and see inside her thoughts as she tried to process her feelings about being an alcoholic. Next slide, please. There are, tucked between the pages of this particular volume of Bradley's diaries, a card announcing an art exhibition at a gallery in Rockport. Next slide. The front page of the Globe the day after the 4th of July in the bicentennial year of 1976. I must have seen that front page. I don't remember the red, white, and blue, but there it is. Next slide, please. The scribbled itinerary for a trip to London, visits to historic sites like the British Museum, hotel stays, that's the Savoy, one of London's oldest and swankiest hotels on April 21st, and tickets for something called the Black Mikado at the West End. Next slide, please. A postcard from the Tate Gallery, Picasso's Woman in a Chemise. Next slide, please. And this extraordinary document, 2 sides of a piece of typing paper covered in print in blue flare pen, filled with annotations and interlinings and lines running around the corner. Portrait of a late middle-aged woman taking stock of the inside of her troubled head, trying to assess her progress towards the goals she'd set for herself, being less judgmental, being more welcoming to people who frustrated her, dealing with her anger at her father for lingering in his final illness, for her siblings in not helping care for her father, and so on and so forth. All of these things tucked in the pages of a single 6-month volume of a diary that went on for multiple decades. What role Barbara Greenough Bradley's diaries will play in helping some future historian make sense of life in the late 20th century, at this point, we have no idea. But the fact that we have them, the fact that we have this extraordinarily rich glimpse inside the life of one complicated, fascinating woman is an extraordinary gift. And we as an institution and the historians who will someday read this and use it to better understand who we and our immediate forebears were are deeply and profoundly grateful to have it. Because Barbara Greenough Bradley is a wild outlier in the historical record. She is a woman who was, by the standards of her time, well-behaved, who did not stick her thumb in the eye of convention, who didn't chain herself to factory gates, who didn't lobby for the right to vote, who didn't fly the first space shuttle into orbit, didn't dive to the depths of the deepest oceans. She had a rich, full, complicated life that she documented, both the joys, like the trip to London, and the struggles in minute detail, and gave us what, for 99.99% of women in prior centuries, we don't have a rich, full, rounded picture, not just of what she did in the public sphere, but of who she was as a person. Imagine if all we knew of Barbara Greenough Bradley was that one newspaper photograph and perhaps a postcard or two from that trip to London. We would, as historians, as citizens of the island, as human beings, be much the poorer for it. All we can do with the women who barely have left traces on the historic record is to keep looking for those traces and piece them together, recreate their lives as best we can. Thank you, and we'll see you in April for another edition of Hidden Collections.
Thank you, Bo. As always, that was fantastic. We are a little bit over time, but we only have one quick question in the Q&A. How did we get the Mary Daggett papers?
We don't have the originals, but Liz Trotter, who's a library volunteer and also the museum's resident expert on all things Vineyard and Revolution, was chasing the story of the Liberty Pole and found a reference in a wildly obscure periodical from the 1840s that came up in a Google Scholar search that mentioned that Mary Hillman had submitted a petition to Congress, and she wrote to the Archivist of Congress and said, "Do you have this petition?" And thanks to the magic of modern technology, back came scans of the 1837 and 39 petitions. Would that we did have them, but in the way of such things, they wound up in the archive of the people to whom they were sent, just like whatever it was that made Helen Tyra write to the FBI.
Excellent. They would be a wonderful addition to our collection, but we can't have everything in our archives, I suppose. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this time on Hidden Collections. We hope we'll see you again next month. Our next program is going to be, as always, on the first Wednesday of the month at 12:30. The date next month is April 6th, again at 12:30 p.m., and we very much hope to see you there. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll hope to see you at the museum soon.